We'll be talking about the contextual tab sample. So let me switch over to, I've got Excel running here, and we put together a contextual tab sample for folks to show how you can build contextual tabs and use them. So I have the add-in running, and it's got a task pane, and the idea is I can import some data and work with it in a table. So let's say I pick a SQL database. And by the way, all this data is just mock data. It's not going out and actually connecting to anything, because we're trying to keep the sample simple and just focused on the contextual tab part. So I import my data, and it goes and creates this table from the SQL database, and it's just a bunch of products and quarters and numbers coming in. And the interesting part is now I have this table data contextual tab that popped up, and it's only there when I'm in the table. If I go move outside of the table, you'll see it drops off. If I go back inside the table, it comes back, along with Excel's. And so I'll just point out a few key things here, because we're going to look at JSON that describes this in a second. And so basically, this is my tab, my table data. I have a menu button here that's in one group, the group's data sources. I have a sync data group and also a task pane group. So it's 3 groups. The show task pane, like if I close my task pane over here and then the user wants to get it back, that does an action. Oh, that's a debug. You can ignore that. It runs a little task to reopen that task pane. These others call code that's in the project itself. So if I go and start making changes on the table, like maybe I just decide to zero those out, I can then submit those and update the mock data, pretending that's going out and updating the SQL database. I can also switch, so I can say, hey, let's go over to the external Excel file. So it's going to reload this, and then I still have my context here. You can see now it's set to the external Excel file. The idea is like maybe you're working with 2 data sources that are super similar, but they're in 2 locations. So you can switch between them and work with them. And that's the contextual tab. So let me switch to the project itself. This will be published to the PnP Office Add-ins repo later today. So it's about to go out the door. And the key parts are, this is generated by YoOffice, and then it was updated to use the shared runtime in the manifest. There's an article on that, which I can share a link to. And then this is the part that is the contextual tab part. So you need to create your JSON that describes the ribbon, the contextual tab. And there's 2 key sections. There's an actions section and the tab section. I kind of like to start down here thinking about this, because you see the UI and you're like, okay, well, how does my JSON describe that UI? So there's one tab in this case. Everything in here is going to have an ID, so that's a pretty consistent pattern. Everything in here is going to have a label, so you'll see that a lot, as well as like visibility tags and so on. And remember, we had 3 groups, so this tab has 3 groups in it. We have one for the data sources. You'll see this a lot too, where we specify the icon, and you have like 3 different sizes for the icon. It's just pointing to my, there's only one icon that gets used for all these, because we don't really have an icon library for our samples. Then you specify the controls to go on there, and you specify what type. So in this case, remember that first one was a menu with a drop down with 2 items in it. So I have my menu, the label, the tooltip. On my menu, I then have items. So I have my first menu item with its ID. It's going to be, it says, hey, I can go get something from an external Excel file. And then here's its label. And then with each of these, the buttons and the menus, you'll see they have an action to run. So it's going to go run this ribbon action. And the way I set this up, you could have a separate action for each one, but I have them all just use the same one, which I'm going to show why I do that here in just a sec. So you'll notice that every menu item runs ribbon action. My button refresh that's here on this other group also calls run ribbon action. But you see it's kind of the same pattern. All your actions are specified at the type, so I only have 2. I've got my run ribbon action, which says it's going to go execute a function. That's its type. And the function name is also run ribbon action, which I might change that name before publishing this, just because I don't want anyone to get confused. This will be an actual function in the JavaScript. So I need something with that name in my JavaScript. This one here is just the ID for this JSON. So all the elements are referring to this ID, and this ID says, hey, Office, when someone clicks on this thing, they'll call this function. Then this next one is, I'm going to show my task pane. So its type is a show task pane, and then you give it the HTML to load for that task pane. So that's it. That's those 2 actions. So let's take a look at run ribbon action. I'll show you how that works. That's going to be over here in my commands.js. So what I'm doing is, because I get past this event, I'm just taking a look at the source ID that's in there. And there are all those IDs that were in that JSON. And I just put like a little 3-letter abbreviation between them so I can kind of keep track when I'm looking at these, what they are. So I know that's my submit button. This is my refresh button. This is a menu item. And for each of these, it just calls out to the actual action I want to run, which is another function. The reason I did it this way, you could do these separately, but I did it this way just because at the end, you always have to remember to call event.completed. And I noticed that as I was adding things and adding more functions, occasionally I forget to call that, and you get very strange behavior on the ribbon if you don't call event.completed. You don't get any errors. It just buttons stop working and it just gets weird. So this way I knew I wouldn't forget to call that. Also, sometimes I want to call these actions from somewhere else in my code, like maybe from the task pane. So I don't want to have to construct an event object or deal with that when I'm calling these things. And the third reason I did it this way is just because if I refactor or rename these, I don't have to remember to go back into the JSON and rename it there as well, or end up with Office trying to call something that doesn't exist. So I kind of like this pattern, but you don't have to do it this way. If you want to have separate functions, you can. Then each of these, they just kind of do what they say. So if someone clicks on the submit button, we want to go update our mock data source with table data. So we call a get table data helper function, pulls the data out of the table, and then we just set our mock data equal to that. Let's see. So I'm going to kind of skip over the actions. Here's where we set up our mock data, and then we have a global. And on the global, important things to point out here, we're going to call that get contextual ribbon JSON. Remember that was back over here where we set up the JSON, and I'm going to have this function that just returns it. So go back over to command. We're going to store that in the global. And we keep track of it because as you want to set things to visible or invisible or enable buttons and so on, you'll need to track that state. So this is how we do that. And then here, we're going to take that run ribbon action button and put it on the global so that it's in the global namespace. And the reason for that is because this name will get minified when we build. And once it's minified, Office won't be able to find it. So we need to make sure it's in the global namespace so it can find it. And again, if you had like 10 different actions in your JSON instead of just one, you would need to put all 10 of them in the global namespace like this. So how do we create it? Let's go over to our task pane HTML, and when that loads, task pane JS, when that loads, our Office on Ready gets called. And so here we're going to call it, we're going to get our global, and we're going to pass that contextual tab JSON, that entire thing, to this office.ribbon.request create controls. And you only get to do this once. So whatever you need to have on your contextual tabs, it needs to all be in there. You don't get to add or subtract to this thing afterwards. So if there's things on there, but you're not going to show them yet, just make sure they're in there, but they're invisible. Also, make sure you await it. I made the mistake of not doing this first time I was putting this together, and one of my events was firing and then immediately trying to update this ribbon before it was created, and you'll start getting errors about IDs not existing and stuff like that. So that's just a safety tip. Make sure you wait for it to be done. That's how you request it. And then if you're going to update it, we go to utilities here. We have, well, for example, an on-changed event. So we track if the table changes, and this on-change will get called. And if we see that, say we moved outside the, or no, we see that the table's been changed, we're going to set our sync buttons to be enabled. So we want to turn the refresh and submit buttons on, so we call with true. So this helper function will do an update. Let me go down to that. So we'll get our global, and then this is kind of the interesting part. We go into that JSON that we have, and we start navigating down through the tabs, the groups, the controls, until we get to the control we want, which in this case, we know the first one is, I think, the refresh, and then the next second one is the submit. We set their visibility status, and then we call office.ribbon.request update. So that's how you do that. And it's the same thing if you're turning your contextual tab on or off. So if the table gets the focus, we'll call this with true, and then we'll go down to our and set its visibility to what was passed in, which let's say that's true. And we call our request update, pass in the JSON from our global, and then that'll update it because we set visible true, it'll now get displayed. So this is the key. You want to update it, call request update, and pass through JSON. And this is why we track it in the global. So I think that's pretty much it. This will get published later today. We'll send out a tweet about it once it's available. And then, let us know if you have any feedback on it.